In the spring of 1902, a seamstress in Harlan County, Kentucky, began taking measurements that had nothing to do with fabric. By summer, 7 people were dead. By autumn, the town's only coroner refused to examine another body. What Margaret Thorne stitched into her final creation wasn't thread, and according to a diary found in 1987, it's still looking for someone to wear it. Harlan County in 1902 was a place where coal dust settled on everything and everyone. The mines ran deep, the winters ran long, and most folks made do with what little they had. Margaret Thorne arrived that March on the afternoon train, carrying 2 leather cases and a letter of introduction from a dressmaker in Louisville. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and looking to establish herself in a town that desperately needed her skills. The boarding house on Clover Street had a room available on the 2nd floor. Mrs. Ella Patterson, who ran the establishment, later told the county sheriff that Margaret seemed ordinary enough at first, quiet, professional. She set up her sewing room in the corner space with the best light, arranged her scissors and measuring tapes with precision, and placed a small advertisement in the Harlan Tribune, offering custom dressmaking services at reasonable rates. Within 2 weeks, Margaret had more work than she could handle. The women of Harlan County hadn't seen a skilled seamstress in years. The previous one had died of consumption the winter before, and most families had been mending their own clothes or making do with ill-fitting store-bought garments. Margaret's work was exceptional. Her stitches were so fine they were nearly invisible. Her patterns fit perfectly on the first try. She had an eye for detail that bordered on uncanny. But it was her measuring technique that people started to notice. Sarah Mullins was Margaret's 3rd client. She came in for a Sunday dress and later told her sister that the experience had been strange. Margaret had taken the usual measurements with her tape, writing them down in a small leather notebook. But then she had asked Sarah to stand perfectly still while she walked around her in a slow circle, not touching her, just looking. Sarah said it felt like Margaret was measuring something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with fabric or fit. When Sarah's dress was finished 4 days later, it was perfect. Too perfect, Sarah told her sister. It fit like a second skin, like Margaret had somehow captured the exact shape of her body and soul. 2 weeks after Sarah picked up her dress, she disappeared. The county sheriff, a man named Robert Hayes, filed the report on May 12th. Sarah Mullins, age 32, had left her home on Porter Street around 3 in the afternoon to fetch water from the well. She never returned. Her husband found the water bucket lying on its side 20 feet from the well, still empty. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, no witnesses. Sarah Mullins had simply vanished into the spring air. Sheriff Hayes questioned Margaret along with everyone else Sarah had interacted with in the days before her disappearance. Margaret showed him her records. Sarah had picked up her dress on May 3rd, paid in full, seemed pleased with the work. That was the last time Margaret had seen her. The sheriff found nothing suspicious in Margaret's responses or behavior. He filed his report and moved on to other theories. But Sarah Mullins wasn't the last to vanish. Between May and July of 1902, 6 more people disappeared from Harlan County. Thomas Brennan, a coal miner; Ellen Crawford, a schoolteacher; James Whitfield, who owned the general store; Ruth Henderson, a widow with 3 children; Daniel Porter, a railroad worker; and finally, in late July, Sheriff Hayes' own deputy, a young man named William Cross. The pattern wasn't obvious at first. The disappearances happened in different parts of town at different times of day. There was no clear connection between the victims beyond the fact that they all lived in Harlan County. But Ella Patterson, who had a good memory for such things, noticed something that made her blood run cold. Every single person who vanished had been a client of Margaret Thorne. Mrs. Patterson shared this observation with Sheriff Hayes on August 2nd, sitting in his office with her hands folded tight in her lap. She had gone through Margaret's appointment book while the seamstress was out making deliveries. Every name matched. Thomas Brennan had ordered 2 work shirts. Ellen Crawford had commissioned a winter coat. James Whitfield had needed his Sunday suit altered. Ruth Henderson had brought in her children's clothes for mending. Daniel Porter had stopped by to have a torn jacket repaired, and Deputy Cross had ordered a new vest just 3 days before he disappeared. Sheriff Hayes confronted Margaret that same evening. According to the notes he made in his official report, now archived in the Kentucky State Library, Margaret remained calm throughout the questioning. Yes, she confirmed, all 7 missing people had been her clients. But Harlan County was a small town, and she was the only seamstress. Nearly everyone was her client. She had served over 40 people in the past 4 months. 7 disappearances out of 40 clients hardly suggested a pattern. The sheriff couldn't argue with her logic. He had no evidence of wrongdoing, no witnesses, no bodies, no motive. He let her go with a warning to report anything unusual she might observe. That night, Ella Patterson locked her bedroom door for the first time in 30 years. The next disappearance happened on August 15th. The victim was a traveling salesman named Howard Price, who had stopped in Harlan County for one night. He had checked into Patterson's boarding house and asked Mrs. Patterson if she knew where he could get a torn coat sleeve repaired. She had reluctantly directed him to Margaret Thorne's room. Howard Price went upstairs at 8 o'clock in the evening. By midnight, when Mrs. Patterson checked on him, his room was empty. His belongings were still there, neatly arranged. His bed hadn't been slept in, and his coat, the one with the torn sleeve, was draped over the chair with the repair completed in perfect, nearly invisible stitches. That was when Ella Patterson went to Margaret's room. What she found there would become the subject of nightmares for the rest of her life. Mrs. Patterson's testimony, given to Sheriff Hayes and later to a circuit judge, described a scene that seemed to belong to a fever dream rather than reality. Margaret's sewing room had been transformed into something else entirely. The walls were covered with sketches, hundreds of them, showing human forms from every angle. But these weren't the usual dressmaker's fashion illustrations. These were anatomical studies, detailed drawings of bodies with measurements marked in places that had nothing to do with clothing, the distance between organs, the depth of muscle tissue, the precise location of major blood vessels. And in the center of the room, spread across Margaret's largest work table, was something that Mrs. Patterson initially mistook for a dress. It wasn't a dress. According to Mrs. Patterson's testimony, it was a complete human form constructed entirely from fabric. Not a mannequin, not a simple figure. It was a full, life-sized recreation of a human body, sewn with such precision and detail that it looked disturbingly real in the lamplight. The skin was made from different shades of muslin and linen, carefully dyed and stitched together to create realistic flesh tones. The face had features sewn in with dark thread eyes made from black buttons, hair attached strand by strand. If you've ever wondered how far obsession can push the human mind, what you're about to hear next reveals how the tools of ordinary life can become instruments of something far darker. Because Margaret Thorne hadn't stopped at creating one figure. There were 8 bodies on that work table, 8 fabric forms, each one slightly different, each one marked with a small tag sewn into the back. The tags bore names: Sarah Mullins, Thomas Brennan, Ellen Crawford, James Whitfield, Ruth Henderson, Daniel Porter, William Cross, Howard Price. Mrs. Patterson ran from the room and didn't stop running until she reached Sheriff Hayes's house 12 blocks away. What happened next is documented in the official county records, though the details have been largely forgotten by history. Sheriff Hayes, accompanied by 3 deputies and the county coroner, Dr. Edmund Walsh, went to the boarding house just after 2 in the morning. They found Margaret Thorne sitting calmly in her sewing room, working on a 9th figure. When they asked her to explain the fabric bodies, she looked up at them with an expression that Dr. Walsh later described as serene. She told them she was learning. The trial lasted 3 days. Margaret Thorne was charged with suspicion of murder, though no bodies were ever found. The prosecution presented the fabric forms as evidence, along with Margaret's sketches and measurement notebooks. The notebooks were particularly damning. They contained not just clothing measurements, but detailed observations about each client, their habits, their schedules, their vulnerabilities. the exact times they were likely to be alone. Margaret's defense was simple and delivered in a voice that never wavered. She was an artist studying her craft. The fabric forms were her attempt to understand human anatomy to better create clothes that fit perfectly. The sketches were anatomical studies. The notebooks were simply detailed client records. She had done nothing wrong. The disappearances were tragic, but they were not her responsibility. She was a seamstress, not a murderer. The jury deliberated for 18 hours. They couldn't reach a verdict. There was no physical evidence of murder, no bodies, no witnesses to any violent acts, just circumstantial connections and deeply unsettling artwork. The judge declared a mistrial on September 3, 1902. Margaret Thorne was released. She left Harlan County the next morning on the 6 o'clock train. Mrs. Patterson watched from her boarding house window as Margaret carried her 2 leather cases down Clover Street toward the station. In one of those cases, according to Mrs. Patterson's later testimony, were the 9 fabric forms, carefully folded and wrapped in brown paper. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. The 9 people who disappeared from Harlan County in 1902 were never found. Sheriff Hayes spent the rest of his career searching for answers. He retired in 1915 without solving a single case. Dr. Edmund Walsh became obsessed with Margaret Thorne's methods and spent years studying anatomy and the human nervous system, trying to understand what she might have been attempting. He died in 1923, his research unfinished. Ella Patterson sold the boarding house in 1904 and moved to Virginia. She never spoke publicly about Margaret Thorne again, but Margaret Thorne herself appeared in records one more time. In 1905, a seamstress matching her description opened a shop in Asheville, North Carolina. The shop operated for 6 months. During that time, 4 people disappeared from the neighborhood. Local authorities questioned the seamstress, but she vanished before they could gather enough evidence to make an arrest. The shop was found empty, except for a work table covered in fabric scraps and a leather notebook filled with measurements and anatomical sketches. After that, the trail goes cold. Margaret Thorne disappeared from official records entirely. No death certificate was ever filed. No further sightings were reported. For 85 years, the story of the seamstress who sewed more than cloth faded into obscurity, remembered only by a few elderly residents of Harlan County and buried in courthouse archives. Then, in 1987, something happened that brought the story back to light. A construction crew renovating a historic house in Lexington, Kentucky, discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall in the attic. Inside the compartment were several items including a leather-bound diary, a set of seamstress tools, and a small fabric bundle wrapped in deteriorating brown paper. The diary belonged to Margaret Thorne. The entries, written in precise, methodical handwriting, detailed her work from 1901 through 1906. The Kentucky Historical Society now holds the diary in their restricted archives, and only portions of it have been made public. But those portions reveal something that confirms every dark suspicion about Margaret Thorne. She had been creating a new form of life. According to her diary entries, Margaret believed that by taking precise measurements of a person, not just their physical dimensions, but their movements, their patterns, their essence, she could recreate them in fabric. Not as simple dolls or figures, but as vessels, empty forms waiting to be filled. The diary describes her frustration with early attempts that failed to achieve what she called transference. She wrote about needing to capture something more than just the shape of a body. She needed to capture the space it occupied in the world. The diary never explicitly confesses to murder, but it describes in detail the process of complete measurement, which required the subject to be absolutely still and silent for hours. It talks about the difficulty of working with materials that wouldn't cooperate and the problem of resistance during the final stage. It mentions the 9 successes in Harlan County and the 4 additional successes in Asheville. And then, in the final entry dated October 14, 1906, Margaret wrote something that has haunted every researcher who has read it. She had finished her masterwork. A figure sewn from pieces of all 13 subjects, incorporating the best elements of each. She had taken the time to get it exactly right. The proportions were perfect. The details were flawless. And according to her careful notes, the transference had worked. The diary ends mid-sentence, as if Margaret had been interrupted while writing. The fabric bundle found with the diary was never opened. X-ray analysis showed it contained what appeared to be a collapsed human-shaped form made from various types of cloth. The Kentucky Historical Society decided that opening the bundle posed too many conservation challenges and potential health risks. It remains sealed in a climate-controlled vault. But here's what makes this story something more than just a historical curiosity. In 2003, a seamstress named Maria Gutierrez opened a custom clothing shop in Portland, Oregon. Her work was exceptional. Her clients raved about how perfectly her clothes fit, how she seemed to understand their exact proportions without taking traditional measurements. She would simply walk around them in a slow circle, looking at them from every angle, then create garments that fit like they had been grown rather than sewn. Maria Gutierrez operated her shop for 11 months. During that time, 6 people disappeared from the neighborhood. When police investigated, they found her shop abandoned. On the work table was a leather notebook filled with measurements and anatomical sketches. The handwriting matched the handwriting in Margaret Thorne's diary from 1902. The notebook is now stored in the Portland Police Department's evidence archives, case number 03-4471, still unsolved. In 2011, similar disappearances occurred near a custom tailor shop in Austin, Texas. In 2016, another series began in Burlington, Vermont. Each time, the pattern is the same. A skilled seamstress arrives in a new place. Her work is extraordinary. People start to vanish. The authorities investigate. The seamstress disappears, leaving behind only measurement notes and sketches. The most recent case was reported in 2019 in Salem, Massachusetts. 4 disappearances in 7 months. The shop closed abruptly. The seamstress vanished. Local police found the familiar leather notebook. This particular notebook is still being analyzed by forensic experts, but preliminary reports confirm that the handwriting appears to match the samples from 1902, 2003, 2011, and 2016, which means either someone has been carefully replicating Margaret Thorne's methods for over a century, or Margaret Thorne herself found a way to complete her transference not into one of her fabric creations, but into something that could move through time, taking new forms, always searching for the perfect measurements, the perfect fit, the perfect subjects. The fabric bundle from 1987 sits in its climate-controlled vault in Lexington. The Historical Society receives requests every few months from researchers who want to open it, to see what Margaret Thorne created as her masterwork. So far, every request has been denied. The official reason is conservation concerns. The unofficial reason, according to a curator who spoke off the record in 2018, is that security cameras in the vault have captured something unusual. On certain nights, usually during the new moon, the sealed bundle appears to move. Not much, just a slight shift, as if whatever is inside has taken a breath. The camera footage is never clear enough to be conclusive, always marked by strange distortions and shadows that don't quite match the lighting in the room. And 17 months ago, in April of 2024, a new custom clothing shop opened in Asheville, North Carolina, the same city where Margaret Thorne operated briefly in 1905. The seamstress who runs it is known for her exceptional work and her unusual measuring technique. She walks around her clients in slow circles, not touching them, just looking, as if measuring something that has nothing to do with fabric at all. She hasn't taken out an advertisement yet. She doesn't need to. Word of mouth travels fast when someone's work is that good. Her appointment book, according to a client who saw it last week, is nearly full. She's already served 23 people since opening, and nobody has disappeared. Yet.